So what is childhood trauma anyway? Hi there, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Syra, the show where I answer your questions about personal growth, mental health, and relationships. Today's question comes from Pam. Pam writes, everyone talks about trauma these days, but it seems that anything that happens to us as kids can be traumatizing. What is childhood trauma? Everyone talks about trauma these days, but it seems that anything that happens to a kid could be traumatizing. So what is childhood trauma? I love this question because it speaks to something that we've been noticing in the field as mental health professionals, which is trauma has kind of become a buzzword, right? It's like, oh, it's my trauma, it's my childhood trauma. But what do we actually mean by that? So I want to unpack that a little bit for you today by talking about three different things. So first is the definition, like the actual psychological definition for trauma. The second is we're going to look at the impact of an event. And then finally, we're going to look at coping. Okay. So let's start with the first one, which is what is trauma? So if you look at the definitions for trauma in the DSM-5, which is kind of it's like the textbook, the textbook for all the problems that we might have. Trauma's defined really as something that happens to you, which is life-threatening, like where you feel you might die, or somebody, you watch that, right? You watch someone else go through a life-threatening experience and maybe even die. So that's a traumatic experience as far as the basic definition of trauma. Now, how do we connect that to childhood trauma? Well, for children, it's not just something that's life-threatening. Even for adults, it's not just life-threatening. It's also like I could have bodily harm, like I could be seriously, severely injured or die from this event. For children, it's that, but it's also the fright, the scaredness, the terror that comes from that event. So even though the event might not objectively to an adult look like something that could be deadly or very seriously injure you, for a child, they have that fright that it could be. And for children, it's especially difficult when they witness their caregivers go through something that's, their bodies could be harmed or that's life-threatening. So what are some situations where we could use this definition of trauma? Okay, so basically something that happens that is really going to be bad for you. Abuse and neglect in the home. So if kids are watching that, either receiving abuse themselves or watching domestic violence in their household, that can create trauma for children. The same things that would cause it for adults, natural disasters, war, those types of things. A serious accident, a life-threatening accident, or life-threatening illness, a sudden or violent loss of a person, death of a family member, a loss, and if there's people in the household that are engaged in substance abuse. So all of these different things can cause like long-lasting trauma in kids. Now, as you're listening to that, you're probably saying, "That's pretty common." Look around the world. I mean, there are wars, there are natural disasters, people pass away suddenly. There may be, in certain contexts, maybe some people are dealing with violence in the home or things like that. And you might wonder because, in a family, 2 or 3 siblings might go through a similar experience, but one person doesn't get traumatized and the other person does. How does that work, right? So I want to talk about that in one of my future videos, so keep an eye out for that. But I just wanted you to have that high level thinking of, okay, this is how we define trauma. That's the first one. The second one is, it's a little bit connected to that, which is what makes a particular event traumatizing for a particular kid? What makes a particular event traumatizing for a particular kid? And a lot of this has to actually do with caregiver response. Okay, so something that feels really dangerous to a kid, perhaps getting bullied at school. Okay, it feels dangerous, your body can be harmed. Some kids get bullied, they move through it, they grow up, they don't really think about it, it's done. Some kids get bullied and it's something that stays with them into adulthood. It's like it creates trauma and it stays. So what's the difference? One of the biggest differences is caregiver response. So Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this, right? That when you didn't have anyone to tell, right? So something painful, something difficult, something awful happened to you as a child, and you didn't have anyone to tell. That's the beginning of a traumatic response, because the caregiver doesn't get to respond to you, right? So we're designed that a difficult thing can happen, but then we come together, we get support, and then we get through it. If you think about, like, for example, natural disasters, right? Communities come together and they help each other through it. They actually demonstrate resilience through those types of things. But if nobody's talking about what's happening, if nobody's listening to the child as they're trying to talk about what's happening, or if the child doesn't feel like they can tell anyone, first of all, something's gone seriously wrong when a child doesn't feel like there's any adults that they could tell. And then it's something that stays, right? Because that caregiver response helps the child make sense of what's happened here, helps give this child language, helps the child work through their emotions about what's happened here. And so if a child, for example, shares that something really awful has happened to them, one of the big things is that we believe them, right? We actually believe, even if it sounds like a little bit unbelievable, you want to give that child the benefit of the doubt that, okay, something really awful has happened. They're trying to articulate it. You know, how do we get to the bottom of this? But as a caregiver, turning towards that child and making it safe for that child to tell. You know, in my sessions with clients, how many times I've heard people disclose their trauma. And these are serious things, right? These are not like, oh, I was left off of the football. Like, no, these are serious things where there's abuse, there's violence, there's inappropriate sexual activity, like all of these things that people have been working, like have had with them all these years and haven't really talked to anyone about them. And when we talk about why didn't you tell your parents, one of the responses I sometimes get is, I didn't want to worry them. I didn't want to put more on their plate. They were so busy. They were going through so much. I didn't want to add to their stress. So that's something to think about, especially for those of us who are parents, right? Are we creating an environment for our children where they see us as always stressed, always busy, and not able to carry one more thing? And so then they go into, you know, just doing it on their own. So it's not that parents are bad and they're not responding. It's sometimes the child doesn't even come forward because of whatever the context is. So that's when the trauma stays, right? Because there wasn't a caregiver response. So that was the second one. So the first was defining trauma. The second is the caregiver response. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about coping. So different children have different ways of coping. And some kids, what makes sense for them for whatever reason is just kind of minimizing the experience and saying it wasn't that big of a deal, right? And this is psychologically a way that we actually deal with trauma, is we say, oh, it's no big deal. And we kind of disconnect from it. We disassociate from it as if it didn't really mean that much. And again, this is a psychological protection method that's really important for kids to be able to have, right? Because the intensity is too much for their little brains and their little bodies. And so they just say, oh, not that big of a deal. Now, when you come into adulthood and you have the capacity to hold those emotions, now some of the memories might be coming back, right? Now some of the questions might be coming up inside of you of like, that really awful thing happened. Did it affect me? You know, these types of questions. And so where you might have disconnected, right? That's the flight, running away from the issue, even mentally. That was a way of coping. And now you might be having to face something, right? So at the time, it wasn't a big deal, but now thinking back as an adult, it's like, actually, that was kind of a big deal what happened to me, right? Or what happened in my family. Oh, I didn't realize that my dad was probably an alcoholic. I just thought he was angry all the time, or whatever it might be, right? So childhood trauma is something that we can sometimes look back and say, oh, wait a minute. Now, I am not a proponent of digging around in the past to find a problem either, right? So it's not to say like there must be trauma in your childhood, not necessarily. But these big things where you were threatened, somebody you really loved or cared for you was threatened, or, you know, could lose their life or could be severely injured. These types of things leave a mark on all of us, but especially on children. So those are my thoughts about what is childhood trauma. We'll be talking about this in a couple of videos more around childhood trauma, so I hope you can join us for that. If you haven't already checked out Monday Musings, every Monday, my husband and I, he's a life coach, we do a little bit of teaching on these different topics. So join us, it's free. You can go to the website at the end of this video. You can also send in a question if there's something you want to know about. Send it in, write it in, and I will respond to it in another video. So hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.